just putting on this event tonight. I guess most of you will, but Sendix is a charity that's transformed a former rubbish tip into a 24-acre green haven and environment centre just 1 mile from the city centre. And if you haven't been, I very much recommend go see how nature can recover with a bit of help from people. We now have over 1,000 species recorded so far, 1 mile from the city centre, and in various habitats. However, tonight's event is not about the dire biodiversity crisis we're facing. It's about facing up to the climate emergency and improving lives while we're at it. The centre was a pioneering design when it opened in 2000, and the aim was for it to be carbon neutral. Now, 20 years on, there's a lot to update and improve to make it a showcase building again, and soon it will be my job in my new role of sustainability officer to do something about it. At the moment, I'm outreach officer, and I didn't even say my name. I'm Ivana. Apologies for that. In the meantime, I'm very keen to showcase, or we are very keen to showcase good examples of building upgrades that reduce carbon emissions, lower bills and increase comfort, and new buildings as well. In our first year of Open Eco Homes, it actually was one of the biggest events of its kind in the country that year, with more than 300 visitors visiting local homes. Sadly, we cannot even dream about that this year, but I hope that you enjoy this virtual session or this virtual version. And without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Phil Bixby, who has effectively supplied us with several homes for the event over the years, including his own. And here's a short video to take you around. And unfortunately, I'll have to stop sharing my.
Welcome to Hogmore Terrace and a quick video tour of our home. Situated at the bottom of Little Hogmore, it's a quiet part of York that I never knew existed until I designed a passive house for Tim and JJ Shepherd. A year or so later, the house next door came up for sale, a rather tired Victorian terraced house, but with a piece of land to the side of it, which meant that as well as the existing house being retrofitted, we could extend it. Our plans were to bring the existing house up to modern standards, to put photovoltaics onto the south-facing gable wall, and to build 2 extensions, one to provide an office for me, and one to extend the living accommodation of the house across the back of the site. This would give views out onto the enclosed rear garden and the rather lovely former landfill site planted with trees to the rear of the house, which is now a wildlife area. While the extensions were thoroughly contemporary, we kept the existing house looking traditional by replacing the aluminium windows that were there when we moved in with Victorian look-alike triple glazed windows set back into the reveals where they would have been. These are tilt and turn windows which still give ventilation when you need it, but are wonderfully well insulated. You can see the extra reveal there from 100mm of insulation on the inside of that front wall. On the gable wall of the house, we externally insulated with 150mm of insulation, and you can see we carefully covered the edges of it with custom-made aluminium trims to fit up against the existing brickwork and the edge of the roof. The lower part of the walls were rendered. The upper part we installed photovoltaic cells both to the gable wall and then to the rear addition roof of the house. Internally, we opened up the back of the house and the flank wall of the back addition to create a new space which linked the existing back room, which is now a dining room, into a new kitchen and living space which ran right across the full width of the site. The extensions are timber frame built on raft foundations. The foundations are prepared, the frames all turned up along with a very large crane, and then were lifted into place. They're all 300mm thick, passive house specification, fully filled with insulation, and the timber frame was all erected within about a day and a half. You can see the depth of insulation from the step in the floor here. The new roofs are flat roofs with a green roof system with sedum, which is just about to come into flower now. The external doors and windows are all triple glazed passive house specification to give us lots of light and lots of views out into the garden to the west of the house. One of our aims was to ensure we got good air tightness throughout, so we could install mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. This ensures that we get clean air throughout the house and also that the heat within the building ends up where we want it to be. And the sophisticated box of tricks gives us plenty of information about what's going on within the system. The photovoltaics feed into battery storage, and the Tesla app gives you a complete rundown on the state of charge of the battery, where any energy is going to and coming from, and also what energy you have used and generated for whatever period you choose to look at. It all works efficiently, but more importantly, it's a lovely place to be. We love the openness of the living space with the kitchen at its heart, and the way that the glazing to the west side of the house brings in afternoon and evening sunlight and links the nature outside with the living spaces inside. Sun shading gives a sheltered terrace and also stops the sun overheating the living spaces in summer. And the terrace leads out onto a small garden and a wildflower meadow that we planted to the rear. Thank you for coming around our house.
If needed.
Fine. I'll keep it brief. I'm an architect and certified passive house designer. We moved in here about 2 years back, so we've got a bit of experience of being here now and seeing what's worked well and what's not. And happy to answer questions, really. So take it away, questioners.
Okay, well, let's start with the one in the chat just to get people going. So Peter was asking about advice on getting a whole house plan drawn up. So you've answered there, but do you have any extra tips on, and maybe explain why a whole house plan is?
Sure,
good?
yeah. I guess the answer really is that I think projects like this work well if you have one contractor involved all the way through from start to finish, or if you're effectively prepared to take on the role of main contractor and then employ subcontractors. Somebody needs to take overall control to make sure that everybody doesn't end up kind of pointing at each other at the end of the job when things don't work. And particularly with issues like air tightness or thermal bridge-free detailing, it really relies on all the various trades and the sequence pieces of work within the sequence of work fitting together the way they should do. If they're all done by different people, then there's an absolute recipe for disaster there, unless somebody is really kind of championing that process to make sure that it all comes out together. I did suggest kind of getting a contractor involved very early. I take Andy's point that before you actually start getting a contractor to kind of look at what needs doing too much, then you need to have a plan. But I think the process of getting contractors involved, looking at what they've done before, talking to them, working out whether you're about to let someone sane and sensible loose on your house or whether you're inviting an axe murderer, all that kind of stuff, I think is kind of something that mostly doesn't get started early enough. So I'd really encourage people to start earlier. What usually happens is, as an architect, you crank out the design work. The client says, "Ooh, how much is it all going to cost?" And then starts talking about firing it out to tender to half a dozen different contractors, which I think is a recipe for disaster. Having a contractor on board through the process of design means that as an architect, I can talk to the contractor about best ways of doing things. The contractor can learn through the process as well about what's important about the design. And generally, you can then have a kind of reasonably harmonious relationship when the hostilities commence on site. So that's my suggestion on that.
Okay, thank you. Now, okay, a few more questions have come in. Lawrence is asking if there's any government funding for solar panels. I'm not sure that's a question for Phil.
but not that I know of. But I mean, I costed up the all of the installation that we did here. So the photovoltaics and the battery. I did a kind of costing exercise on that to try and work out what the costs would be and what the benefits would be. My experience at the moment is that you've still got very long payback periods if you seriously want to get every penny back that you put into it. But on the other hand, the comfort and the general environmental benefits, I think, need to be weighed in as well. So yeah, it's I mean, I had to do it. Simply, I had to, because I'm who I am, and therefore, if I'm going to bleat on everybody else about the fact they should be doing it, I've got to do it myself. So that was really part of the thinking here too.
Great. Now, more of a question about the house. Has anything gone wrong that you weren't expecting? Anything that bugs you?
Anything that bugs me? God, Caroline's going to skin me if I don't come up with something on this. I guess the only thing that I regret, well, the one thing that hasn't performed the way I thought it is that I used PHPP, which is the Passive House design package, to do the overall kind of energy modeling of the house. The issue with PHPP is that it deals with the house as a whole. And that's usually okay, but what we've got here is, because my office is effectively kind of semi-detached, I treated it as being part of the house, when in fact it behaves very differently in terms of how it's used, the kit that I've got in here in terms of heat generating computers and all that kind of stuff, and also in terms of the construction of it is effectively a new build bit, whereas the rest of the house is this mixture of new build and existing construction. My office runs quite warm. That's not entirely problematic, because I can fling a window open or shut the door open. But it's certainly something where we ended up retrofitting some additional solar shading to try and make sure that we didn't get additional heat coming in summertime that we didn't want. I think beyond that, we got all the light switches in the wrong places, because we ended up using, kind of coming into the house different ways to the ways we expected. But then I assume everybody always gets all the light switches in the wrong place, so my conscience is clear on that. And I think pretty much the rest of it works the way we expect it to. So certainly, I mean, we get about between a third and a half of our total power consumption from the sun, which was better than the PHPP predictions, and slightly better than the photovoltaic installers predictions. The house stays warm all the way through the year. You probably noticed in the video, we've got a wood burner in the living room. We've used it twice. On each occasion, we burnt 2 hot blocks on it and then turned it off or let it burn out, because it really was there as something that was for extreme conditions, or just one of those things as a kind of real treat once in a while. And thus it's proved. The rest of the heating of the house is done by the mixture of heat into the mechanical ventilation system, electric towel rails in the bathrooms, and a bit of underfloor heating just in kind of key bits of the living space.
Okay. I think nicely leading into that is Jesper's question on how did you integrate the mechanical heat ventilation recovery system into the original part of the house? And he's also curious whether you went for branch or radial ducting and what main unit you installed.
Man,
so this is for the technical geeks out there.
It's a good question. Yeah, we ended up using a set of manifolds in the loft space, and then running it's a semi-flexible plastic ducting throughout the house, which means that you're using ducts which are about 75mm diameter, and you can generally sneak them through existing floors and find corners of rooms to drop them down into and things like that. And we kind of designed cupboards and alcoves, so we had to kind of false back to them to give space for ductwork to drop through. So a little bit of thought had to go into kind of how we snuck all the stuff through, particularly where we've got beams in floors and things like that. But we managed to get it all fitted okay, and subsequently commissioned, tested, and all works fine. But yes, it does. You do have to think a bit about it, and certainly, had we done it all in rigid ductwork as a radial system, we'd have probably had it'd have been a tricky one to do. The main unit is what is it? It's my mind's gone blank. I'll check and post it in the chat box.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Yeah, I'm in sort of part way through doing it myself. That's why I'm curious. Thanks.
Okay, another one from Maria. Are there any issues with introducing a passive house specification extension next to a not passive house retrofit? How do you stop all the heat leaking through the retrofit? Was the 100 millimeter insulation enough?
Yep. The performance of the existing structure. So yeah, we did 100 mil polyurethane insulation on the inside of the front and back walls, 150 mil on the external of the exterior of the gable wall, which wasn't quite as high a specification in terms of the U value, the reducing thermal transmission, as if we had done it to passive house standard, but it's not far off. There were one or two bits of the structure we had to make compromises on. So, for example, we couldn't do floor insulation to the existing part of the house because it's halfway to fallen down in the past. It's been underpinned and the floor is a structural member which we couldn't do anything with. So there were issues around some bits of the building like that. So there were bits of it that we couldn't take up to the same specification, but basically we took the view that if we got the bits that we could do up to the highest specification possible, then the overall kind of compromise still works okay. I didn't go for passive house specification or retrofit specification or certification rather, because the layout that we chose to use with effectively, in technical terms, it's very sticky outy, if you know what I mean. It's not a kind of simple kind of rectangular 2-story block. It's very much got lots of surface area for the volume of house that's within it. So I knew it wasn't going to hit passive house numbers, and I merely used the PHPP software to make sure that the overall heating requirements were going to be sensible. So what PHPP showed was that our overall heating requirement, worst case scenario, so if it's kind of -10 outside and you want to keep it warm through winter, was about 3.5 kilowatts. So that's kind of not down at passive house standards, which would be around about 1 or 1.5, but it's still pretty good in comparison with most houses of this kind of size and complexity.
Is it perhaps worth saying something about passive house standard? Because I don't know if everyone here is familiar with it. And because
Anybody want
that...
to raise their hands if they know what passive house is all about? No, okay. I'll do a very quick.
I'm just thinking that the fascinating bit about it is how it's centered on comfort.
Yeah, I mean, passive house is basically an approach to building where you model it very carefully. So PHPP is a design tool. It's not like the Sept assessment where you simply do the house and then tick the boxes afterwards. It's used as a design tool, and you put lots of information into it, and it gives you very accurate results out of it. Passive house is about basically fabric first thinking. So it's about getting good standards of building fabric insulation, very high quality windows and external doors, good levels of air tightness, which in the UK climate pretty much means you've got to have mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, because the air tightness is such that to give air quality inside, you need that mechanical supply of air. And thinking about thermal bridge-free design. So rather than just thinking about well-insulated walls and well-insulated floors, thinking about how you connect the two to each other to make sure you don't design gaps in there which heat can escape through. So the idea of doing all of that lot is to bring the heating, the space heating requirements of the building right down, not necessarily in itself to zero carbon. So you can't say that passive house equals zero carbon, but you can do passive house to zero carbon. But to get it down to the point where the kind of the heating that you use becomes much less crucial. So, for example, certainly in mainland Europe and in Germany, a lot of passive house stuff there uses electrical heating, where it's kind of the fact that you still have some heating requirement isn't crucial, because the amount of heating required is very low, and you can then start to think about things like using renewables or on-site renewables, or getting kind of zero carbon energy in order to provide the heating you do need. Does that kind of work okay in terms of a kind of broad introduction to what passive house is about?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank
you.
you.
But the other thing I'd say about it is it requires the contractor who builds the building to do a proper job. Passive house includes a certification process, which means that you don't get a certificate until after the house is built. Airtightness has actually been tested, and you've provided information to demonstrate that the builder has actually built what's on the drawings. So it's very different to building regulations, where you get your approval, a chap turns up half a dozen times if you're lucky, and you get your chitty at the end of the day.
So I think it might be worth saying, although I kind of know the answer, is do you think you can actually recommend installers and contractors that are local, which may be of interest to people who are thinking of using the green grant scheme or planning any big works?
I think, I mean, I've only used the passive house jobs I've done. There've been 2 or 3 different contractors who've been involved with this, and in one case, certainly Builder Kit, who are the timber frame company who made timber frames for this place and for Tim and JJ's house next door, acted as contractors all the way through. In fact, on 2 of the houses that I've done, they did that. I think in York, I mean, there are 2 or 3 contractors I've worked with in York, not specifically always on passive house, but often on fairly well insulated buildings. I think given that we're all going from a standing start on this, 5 years ago, I'd never done any passive house projects, but and there are certainly very few contractors who've that much experience working with high levels of insulation, high levels of airtightness. So my advice would be choose contractors who are prepared to learn. Choose a contractor who wants to get to the kind of standards that passive house requires, and choose contractors who you can genuinely work in partnership with, and who are going to be honest about what they can do, honest about where they need to take on additional information or additional skills, and where you stand a chance of coming out of it, both of you having got what you wanted at the end of the day.
Okay.
That sounds incredibly evasive. I'm not naming anybody, but you'll probably realise why I'm not doing that.
Yes. So I think there was a question on triple glazing that's mostly been answered in the chat, but I wonder, do you have any advice on, because I know you've given me good advice on choosing triple glazing. So if you want to say something on that.
Yeah, there are some window manufacturers do get their windows certified as passive house components. They would also generally do windows which aren't certified, so there is cost involved in the certification process, which then racks up in terms of the cost of the windows. So yes, not all triple glazed windows are the same, both in terms of the type of glazing units, type of frames that are used to construct it, and then the airtightness of them at the end of the day. So certainly ask around, shop around. The Green Building Store are very good at giving advice out. And if anybody wants any information about the specific manufacturers who were used here, then just stick something in the chat box about it, and I'll make sure that I check with Ivana afterwards and pass information out.
Great. I think the one bit of advice you gave me is sort of try and find out how they manufacture the windows. And I did visit one local manufacturer, which shall remain unnamed, and discovered that they basically used double glazed frames and just put a couple of extra hinges and an extra pane of glass in there, which is not quite the idea. So yes, it's worth doing your research. Now, I think you did answer where your heating comes from already, so
yeah, the heating's all the 3 kilowatt source heating. It's all electric, mixture of, say, some through the mechanical ventilation system, some through straightforward heated towel rails in bathrooms and toilets, and some through a bit of electric underfloor. The electric is naked electric. I mean, because we have the solar panels and the battery storage, what I'm able to do is firstly get a fair chunk of that from the sun. Secondly, use the battery to effectively shift when we buy electricity in, to make sure that we're always buying electricity at times when, wherever possible, at times where electricity is cheap. In terms of using electricity, it's almost as important when you're using it as it is how much you're using. So simply being able to use electricity at a time when it's the grid is chunking it out, simply because they've got power stations switched on, and they can't be. It's easier to keep them running than it is to switch them off and switch them back on again. then that means that I can with a reasonably clear conscience use grid electricity. But were I doing it all again now, would I go for an air source heat pump? Don't know, might do. Certainly worth thinking about.
Great. I think there's just a couple more before we move on to Lars's video. How did you deal with the potential thermal bridge on the upper story between internal wall insulation on the east and west facing walls and the external wall insulation on the south facing walls?
Simply by wrapping them round as far as possible, so taking the insulation on the external walls into the alcoves as far as I could, and just trying to create as big a gap between inside and outside as I could. It's not perfect, but it's the best I can do.
Great. And I think Andy's already answered the question on passive houses being healthier.
Job, yes.
Yep.
Thank you, Andy.
So yes, passive houses, because they filter the air, they are much better for people with allergies or lung conditions. Do you feel that you're getting better air when you're at
my
home?
lungs are as clean as a whistle. The interesting thing is when you change or clean the filters. So once every 3 months, you're supposed to whip them out and either change them or what us cheapskates do, which is to hoover them. And the amount of crap you find in them is a sight to behold, and the fact that that's ended up in there rather than up your snout is very definitely a good thing. So yes, I do enjoy the fact that we've got this bit of box of tricks doing that stuff in the background for us.
Great. I think that's, I believe, all the questions pretty much answered. So thank you, Phil, very much. You can relax now.
Hello and welcome to Copmanthorpe and to the virtual Eco Homes tour for York. And we are here in front of our wonderful semi-detached house that we bought about 3 years ago, and which was originally built in the 1920s. But as you will see in the next couple of minutes, we did a lot to renovate and modernize this home. Come and I will show you. So what have we done to the house? One of the main objectives of our house renovation project was to achieve better energy efficiency and insulation. So we looked into the different options and opted for inside insulation through insulated plasterboard, which we applied to all the inside external walls. We were also looking into insulated rendering, but there are different pro and cons regarding inside or outside insulation, and we have just been advised not to do both because of the trapment of humidity, and you're getting problems with damp, particularly in older houses. What we have also done is roof insulation, which we're going to see just in a couple of minutes time, and floor insulation, where we used different kinds of kingspan insulation, particularly under the underfloor heating, to project more of the heat where we want it and not just heating the underbelly of the house. So this is, for example, in the porch, and this is the one we used in the main bits inside the house. Beside insulation, we also looked into the energy production and the heating system. The house originally had an oil-fired heating system, and we replaced this with this little fridge freezer combination, which is our air source heat pump. And it's very convenient and quite cheap from our perspective to run. We had gas heating before, and also the noise is really minimum. There's sometimes a humming sound when it's on full work, but even if you sit in the garden or in the kitchen just behind it, you're not disturbed, or you're even taking notice of it.
So this is mission control for the heating system. As you can see, it looks more or less like a standard boiler room probably in any other house. We had in our old house also a gas heating system, and this one is as easy and convenient as the old ones. You have all the panels and operation modules that you need to set your preferred water temperature and your preferred heating temperature. And then we have in each of the rooms a little transmitter where we can set individually the temperature that we would like to have in the house. But as you can see on the little frost symbol here, that currently our heating is still off because it's still nice and warm and the temperatures are right. But as soon as winter really arrives, we can be nice and cozy on renewable energy.
So now we are on the roof. As you can see from a semi-detached perspective, the original house has some sort of a U-shape, and we put the solar panels here in place to mainly support our heating system. Otherwise, a roof terrace would probably have also been quite a nice thing, because on a good day you can see the dales in the background or over the fields of Copmanthorpe. What we also have done, as you can see from our beautiful garage, which has a huge flat roof, we put already additional cabling in place, so if we ever wanted to add further solar panels over there, we could connect them quite easily to our current system. Welcome to our wonderful attic. As you can see, it's not one of a fancy converted one where everybody can just stand. It's more a storage one, and we put roof insulation in, and this is the other technical device that we installed to work with the solar panels, which is the battery. So the battery is not giving us independence from the grid, so we're still connected to the grid. You need a completely different system if you want to be the only illuminated house in a blackout situation, but this battery enables us to benefit more from the solar panel, which of course is collecting the energy during the day, but we have a lot of usage during the evening and night time. We got not just the battery, we also got with other electric appliances timers, so our washing machine, dishwasher, ovens, bread maker, all these kind of things can be timed so that we actually use the energy when we are producing it during the day. Otherwise, yeah, so far it gives us normally sufficient energy to bring us well through the night, so that we don't need additional energy that we would buy from the grid. Good evening. I'm Lars Kramp, and I'm not a video director, so as you probably have seen, this is not my profession. Architecture or engineering is also not my profession, so I'm an amateur when it comes to house renovations, and
particularly on this scale that we have done here in our current house. We haven't done something like that in the past. The old house that we had was a smaller semi-detached three-bedroom house, and the only thing that we really did was the usual renovation things, painting walls, putting new carpets in and things like that. So this was on a completely different scale, but because we were quite picky for what we looked into our house, we came upon this opportunity house, which was in how the real estate agents always say, in need of some upgrading or modernization, which in the end, when it comes to the question what were the biggest surprises, the biggest surprises are the same surprises that you have with any old house that hasn't been renovated for a long time. As soon as you take a floorboard up, as soon as you take plasterboards down or look behind the ceiling, there are a lot of surprises. We were trying to prevent big financial surprises as well when it comes to the renewable heating and electricity system. That is why we more or less outsourced that as an individual project to one company. So the solar panels, the air source heat pump, the underfloor heating system with all the plumbing involved, and so on, and the battery were all installed by the same company, which enables you to bridge some of the contractor issues that you might otherwise get when your electrician and your plumber need to speak with your heating installer and things like that. In general, we worked with our contractor. Our contractor has had experience in project management of normal building project, but has never done a house on this scale. So we worked there together, gave him the opportunity a bit to learn, and he was quite keen to get more experience in dealing with these kind of environmentally friendly renovations. So that was a good learning experience for us all, and in the end, it worked quite well, and we didn't stay completely on budget, but we stayed quite nicely in our time frame, because my wife's birthday is in August, and we wanted to move in on her birthday at the latest, and we moved in the day before her birthday. So you could say that is staying in line with the expectations there. Maybe also picking up some of the questions or how they might be relevant that Phil got there. We were still lucky, one of the last ones who are getting feed-in tariff for the solar panels, but just on one of the last tiers before it completely disappeared. But it is not really the game changer. There. We're probably getting between 20 and 30 pounds feed-in tariff every quarter. So that is not contributing a lot to the initial cost. So the main thing about solar panels these days is you need to make sure that you consume the energy yourself, because that's the saving that you're doing. You're not buying energy, and then having an electric heating system which actually can be programmed in creating the heat during the day. So when you're then coming in the evening, gives you the opportunity to actually have a very high intensive user during the time when the house is actually producing energy. And what we normally manage also, due to the insulation that we have, we don't have a very long heating period. We're probably now coming a bit closer to where we come to the decision to switch on the heating, but so far we have switched it off before we got the heat wave in spring, and then haven't really switched it back on. So it was just the hot water that was running on the system, but the heating was off, and we have, like Phil, a wood burner in the living room, which we have used on a couple of evenings just to get the edge a bit out of the temperature. But generally, we're quite happy with how the house is retaining and you can actually regulate with curtains and things like that. So if we have a very hot day, keeping curtains closed, the house is still cool at the end of the day, and the other way around. If you let the sun in, that is also contributing quite a lot to heating up the house. Financially is also, we are benefiting from the renewable heating incentive scheme of the government, which is a scheme which gives you a certain amount of money based on the tier, how bad you are in the beginning and how well you're saving carbon through the new heating system. And that is over 7 years, and it works actually out for us that after the 7 years, without any other savings from fuel costs or things like that, we have the money back in that we invested in the air source heat pump itself. And then of course there's the advantage that we don't pay gas or we don't pay oil at this point. That is also paid quarterly based on the consumption of the system. A bit of an advice: if you're planning something like this, it's quite important that you get your energy performance certificate before you're doing any significant insulation work or other things, because you're getting a higher grade as worse your energy performance certificate is. So do it at the point, an assessment when it's at its worst, and that helps you with some of the funding and grants that you can get there. If you then later want one to just show yourself how well you improve from an G to an A, you can do that. That is not affecting that. It's just relevant for the point when you apply for the heating incentive scheme at the beginning. I don't have these fancy apps or other things that Phil was showing. There is a possibility to get all these things, which is an extra service that our contractors or our suppliers have offered us, but I'm not that technically geeky that I thought I actually need that. I have the I have the basics. I can see from the standard panels how much we're producing, where the energy is currently coming from, and how well stocked the battery is, and what our consumption from the grid is. And that's more or less the basic things that are sufficient for me at that point. But there is all these kind of systems offer you significantly more if you're interested in having live coverage on your smartphone or other things.
Okay, wow, that's a lot of extra detail. Thank you, Lars. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and I think your house certainly shows, judging sort of from what you've said so far, it confirms what Andy has said, that you don't have to go through lots of certification process to get a nice, comfortable home. It can be done a bit more cheaply, or even though having the certification is definitely nice. So one question was, were all your original floors suspended, or did you need to deal with any solid floors?
Yes, so for the underfloor heating, we needed to level them all out. The majority of them were suspended floors, and quite significantly. So in the old snug, which is now part of our kitchen half, if I was standing there, it was literally just my head looking out. So that's why it was very important to put some sort of reflectors and insulation under there, because otherwise there was a lot of ground to heat. We had a concrete floor in what used to be the first kitchen extension. So that was my first experience with a jackhammer. And I can just utterly recommend, it is something that you should do once in a life, not necessarily more than once, because you're quite knackered afterwards. But yeah, we removed a concrete floor there, and then we had in one of the oldest part of the house a wonderful clay and mud floor, and it was really just with shovel and a pickaxe, and I felt a bit like one of the seven dwarfs digging through the mine there, so that we had enough room there for the underfloor heating and insulation and so on. So yeah, we leveled it out.
Wow, yeah, Phil recommends getting a mini digger next time, but certainly sounds like a good workout, and it is amazing how sometimes, yeah, stuff like that can be really invigorating. There was a question about a cat flap. Phil has already revealed that he does not have a Passive House certified cat flap. Have you got one? Have you got a cat?
No, but we also don't have a passive house. There was, I think, somewhere a question regarding ventilation. We don't have a mechanical ventilation. Our ventilation is we can open the windows, or we have also some of the moisture releases, the standard ones on the windows that we can open. But normally in the winter time, you're getting into a routine that you refresh the air on a regular base, and in the summer you can just leave some of the flaps open. But yeah, we don't have a cat and no flap. But I would actually be interested, how does it work with letterboxes?
Phil?
We don't have a letterbox. We've got an
Okay.
external box on the wall. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yeah, the last thing you want is a hole in the front door. Just on the cat flap, yeah, I mean, that you can. There are one or two manufacturers, I think, who are now doing slightly less outrageously priced, well insulated cat flaps. But certainly, when I was looking, the only one that was available was also sold through EcoWin, who did our windows. It was £2,000. So I thought, much as we like the cat, you know, we don't like it that much. So the amount of heat that leaks through it, because it does seal pretty well, is pretty minimal.
But that goes a bit off topic. If you're such a cat lover, there's actually facial recognition technology out there for cats that can unlock the door. So you don't need a cat flap if your door recognizes your cats and just lets it in. But yeah,
we were much more low tech than that. And in fact, the contractor managed to fit the thing back to front first of all. And we only discovered this when it let a random cat into our house, which got stuck in there some months later. So, you know, that's us.
Oh gosh. Of course, and then, as Andy points out, cats are good sources of heat, so maybe you should just not let them out in winter. But that's probably not sound advice for.
The point that unrelated Phil was just making was putting things up the wrong way around. One thing that is very important to check, particularly if you're using an installer who's not that experienced in these kind of setups, is that the battery and the solar panels and so on are all wired correctly. Because what is a common mistake that you hear about if you exchange views with other people who have this kind of energy is that the constructor first put the battery in a way that it's charged from the grid. Of course, that is not what you want. You don't want to pay for it, that they're charging constantly your battery. So it is quite useful if you keep in the first days an eye on the different levels. Of course, they should check it, but nevertheless, better early you realize something is off here. One indication, for example, if your battery is charging during the night time and it should charge from the solar panels, that is not a good sign. But that is something to look out for, because yeah, I've heard that from a couple of people.
Yes, I think I'm one of those. That was a bit of a surprise. Okay, just one more question. Oh, I've lost it now. So I think there was a question about solar to immersion heater diverter. I'm guessing you don't have that one because you would have probably mentioned it. So maybe
What
I'll
was it
leave
exactly?
that. I think maybe I'll leave that one in the chat because that, yeah, I don't think you have that. So maybe we'll leave that out. But are you monitoring sort of the performance of the house in any other way besides sort of watching the, you know, the energy generation and consumption? Are you keeping an eye on sort of dampness in walls or anything like that?
We're not doing it constantly anymore. We did it in the beginning because there were actually 2 walls which were in our initial building survey indicated as being damp. So we measured that for a bit afterwards, but there was no indication that there was anything wrong with that. After it was caused in the beginning because somebody painted with some nasty paint over the damp-proof line from the outside, and after that was resolved and there was a nice and hot summer during our renovation, the wall was stone dry and nevertheless we measured for a couple of months, but it was all in expected parameters.
Excellent. So I think, yeah, I think again, someone on the chat congratulated you on an excellent project. I think both Phil's and Lars are definitely well worth looking at. So now we'll move on to the next, which is my floor, which actually happens to be right here below me. So I'll share the screen. But, and this is something I didn't get around to checking with Andy, actually, before I do this, Andy, would you be all right to introduce yourself and just maybe say why you went into this project with us?
Okay, hello. Can you hear me? I'm Andy Walker from Sure Insulation, and I've been doing this for a decade or so. And it's all about believing that every home can be made warm and comfy with ultra low builds. If you've got a grand design budget like Phil obviously has, and I'm very impressed with Lars' project as well, although I wouldn't have done it quite like you've done it, Lars, I have to say. And it's all about working together. It's all about creating a massive difference so that we can start tackling carbon emissions and health and well-being and fuel poverty. And over the years, I've developed a series of approaches which work to create a continuous envelope that's airtight, and provided you ventilate it right, you can get a really nice environment.
Great.
Will that do as a start?
Yep, I think that's a good start. So I'll share the slides. So I'm afraid it's not a video from me. I haven't been able to do that. So I'll talk you through slides. If hopefully there won't be too much detail, I'll try and sort of whiz through. But yeah, so housewarming party. And of course, this is where things stop moving again. Oh, there we go. Okay, so when I first heard Andy talking about housewarming parties, I just thought, right, I want to have one. I really want to host one. I think the idea is really simple and wonderful. Actually, rather than teaching people in a classroom about how you do insulation and why it's important to do it right, you actually teach people by improving a house while you're doing it. So you invite people around and the work gets done, the householder gets it done at some lower cost. People learn how to sort of new skills, and they can draw on each other's help in the future. And by doing the work yourself, you can actually often get a better job done than a contractor who may not have the interest or time to be thorough and mindful of how insulation actually works. So my partner needed a little bit more convincing that inviting a group of strangers round to rip up our floorboards was a good idea, but eventually he agreed. And we don't drive or fly or eat meat, so eco-retrofitting our house is the next best way that we can actually improve our carbon footprint and our standard of living at the same time. So we set the date for 6th of April 2019 and began preparations. Andy Walker would be there to provide his technical expertise, while your community energy and Nix kindly facilitated the workshop because I'm involved in both organizations and agreed to be the guinea pig to host the first housewarming party in York. We've already talked a bit about sort of whole house plans and why they're important, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. And certainly there's a great video by Andy about doing home assessments, because that was the first thing we did actually to come up with a plan for the house, and the party was just one part of that. And the kind of review gave us a plan of action, which we aim to carry out over the next few years, because unfortunately we don't have the time or the money to do it all at once. But having the sort of big plan means that we can sort of plan works at different times, and we can make sure that we kind of don't do anything now that might hinder what we want to do later. So that means kind of generating a kind of a no regrets plan, and also minimizing potential risks, because just like with most upgrades, I guess there's always some risk of things going wrong, because effectively you're making changes to a complex system that was designed to work in a certain way, and now you're adapting it to make it a bit different. So when installing insulation, you need to make sure that it's done well and that you're not generating problems with mold or condensation. And looking at those figures there, I think, you know, it might look like floor 15% heat loss, might not sound like an awful lot, but actually that's where your feet are. And cold surfaces can actually make more of a difference to how well we feel, how warm we feel, than the air temperature. So wrapping up the floor in insulation can actually be can make a major difference. And in a terraced house, which we lived in before moving here, that can actually be a bigger surface area than your external walls. So it's well worth looking at that. So the preparations began. So we looked under the floorboards first to check that our assumptions about what's underneath are correct and that there are no obvious signs of damp issues, which would need resolving first. That's definitely would recommend checking that first. So I measured the depth of the void and discovered it was about 40 centimeters, and that meant we could put about 30 centimeter layer of mineral wool down there to ensure that there's still air circulation underneath, keeping the area dry. And we wanted to go as deep as we could with the insulation, because when it comes to insulation, most of the cost is in labor. So if you can get as much insulation as possible, because that, you know, to achieve as good a U value as possible. Now, again, I'm not going to go into explaining U values, because Andy's got the trick in how to do it really well. And again, there's the video, which I will send a link to later. But the basics of it is, it's the sort of flow rates at which heat kind of goes through a building element or material, and you want the value to be as low as possible so that you're losing as little heat as possible. And a typical uninsulated suspended timber floor on a ground floor has a U value of around 3.3 watt per square meter per Kelvin. And if you properly insulate it, you can take it down to 0.15 or less. So by insulating our floor, we actually improved its U value by around 20 times. And that does result in improved comfort. Obviously, U values may not mean an awful lot if you then discover you've got big gaps between floorboards and there's actually drafts kind of merrily going through because the people who put new floorboards in couldn't be bothered to actually put them well together. So one thing that's I meant to say earlier, actually, before any insulation, doing sort of maintenance work, repairing things is always a good port of call. Next, we sort of used the opportunity. We decided not to save the floorboards. As you can see, they were not in the best shape. It's not worth it unless you're really, really precious about your floorboards, because it takes a lot of time to take them up in a way that you can then put them back together. We didn't have to worry about that, which meant that preparation was a lot easier. We could just rip them up, and that meant that as part of the preparation work, we could move a radiator and put new electrics in, sort of a new electric switch, and do other sort of repairs. We moved the radiator away from the window because we want to be able to insulate the wall later on. So that was one way in which we were making sure that our plan was made easier in the future. And also putting radiators under windows is a bit daft these days because you know, we're not in Victorian houses where you need to get sort of maximize the heat air, sort of trying to combat the cold air coming down from the windows. So having radiators on internal walls where you can keep the heat within the house is much better. But back to the party, we sort of also borrowed some tools, bought materials, and then it was party time. What else do you do at a party? Then have a health and safety briefing first. So we started with that, and we also had a chat about U values and how we were going to go about the business. And then we started lifting floorboards. So one group started doing that, removing floorboards using circular saws and all sorts of other tools. And that turned out to be relatively easy. That was relatively quick, but then getting rid of the nails sticking out turned out to be a lot more time consuming. And Andy wanted everyone to have a go at the different tools that we had, but leaving the rusted nails out actually proved to be really difficult and time consuming. And the angle grinder, in the end, just everyone wanted to have a go at that because that made the whole thing a lot easier and a lot quicker. But we spent, yeah, quite a bit of time on the floorboards. The things you find underneath when you actually open up is interesting. We had lots of rubble. I didn't bother including a picture of that, but rubble you really want to remove because it can be trapping moisture and that can potentially lead to mold entering your house. So that was something, we had several bags of that. Builders just think that, you know, sweeping things under the carpet literally is a good thing to do. So we removed rubble. There were all sorts of unknown wires which we had to kind of work out what to do about. We had this extra wall which we didn't know was there, which was, I guess, was holding up the hearth when that fireplace was an actual fireplace. And that meant that the continuous layer of insulation would not, or rather the air that we wanted to be circulating under the floor would have this obstacle in the way. So in the end, we had to break that wall to ensure that air could actually circulate under that bit of the floor. So you find all sorts of things, and you need to be prepared to deal with problems as you go along. And that's really where you need someone like Andy there to help you deal with those. The next step was creating the matrix, or as we called it, matrix on which the insulation would be suspended. So we had the other group of workshop participants twisting, I think was it about 100 wall ties in the end. So wall ties are normally used to keep two layered walls together. And if you twist them by 90 degrees, they create these wonderful hangers from which you can suspend your sort of battens and basically for keeping the insulation in place. They were suspended at relatively regular intervals and sort of hammered in. And then you hang your matrix from them. So where we had these long battens where they crossed, we sort of cable tie them together so that insulation couldn't push through and drop in between. And as you can see, we had to deal with pipes and wires. So if pipes were going under the insulation layer, they would be insulated to make sure they would not be wasting any heat. And wires that were going through were put in conduits to make sure they don't overheat and potentially cause a fire risk. So we had to deal with those. And I think it's worth mentioning how important it is to insulate pipes, which is often underestimated. I remember Andy telling me that about according to his calculations, about 6 meters of uninsulated copper pipes, which we had plenty more of under there, is similar to having about a 500-watt radiator attached to the outside of your house and merrily trying to heat up the planet without you getting a bit benefit out of it. And that was the end of day one. So Matrix was done, but we didn't get around to actually insulating the floor as such. We just warmed ourselves by burning some of the floorboards that we ripped up. And we had to thank, I'd like to thank again, Nicole, Helen, two Andy's, Martin, Jamie, and Johnny and Tom for helping us do this. And I need to thank even more two Andys who came back the day after to actually help us lay the insulation. Now, I'm definitely not going to explain how we dealt with this problem. You can go on the blog and read the details there, but to ensure air circulation, air bricks like this, which are sort of poking in between the two spaces that, so the top of the floor, which will be insulated, and sort of under the, you kind of need to make sure that air can still circulate basically. So we had to find a way to effectively kind of split the vent into halves, and but it's a bit technical, so I'll leave you to read about that one. But once all of that was done, we could finally don our dust masks on and tape up the sleeves because mineral wool is somewhat itchy, and then spend a few hours threading the insulation at right angles under the joists. Now we had to make sure that all the pipes were sort of, again, either insulated or not, depending on whether they were being tucked into the insulation or not. And for some reason, we ended up having to make a shopping trip for more mineral wool, which we hadn't anticipated. So it took us a few hours to lay the layer number one. And then guess what? Oh, that's the finished layer number one. A few hours later, layer number two, 10 minutes. Andy actually stood back, put the timer on, and just watched us. And it took us just under 10 minutes to fit the final layer, which was, yeah, highly satisfying. Now you might think we are nearly there, but we still had to return the floor to usable space because it's incredibly easy to actually walk off the joist and just land in the insulation as it's nicely stretched out. It looks surprisingly much like floor, and it's too easy to fall in between. And it turned out, we thought we'd done the hard bits, but actually placing the chipboards turned out to be quite difficult because we had uneven walls and badly fitted skirting boards. We had to cut around sort of the radiator pipes. It was quite tricky. The boards are quite heavy. You need about 2 people for each. So only a few of the boards could actually be fitted as they were because the tongue and groove sections made it somewhat, again, more challenging. But eventually, and I would definitely say measure as many times. If you're not sure, measure again, because you will regret making cuts if you don't. And then, semi-final stage, to ensure airtightness and that the panels would stay put, we had to kind of mind the gaps. As you can see, the gaps under the skirting boards were just ridiculous. They are all over the place in different heights. I actually remember someone at Situ and at a project in Leeds saying proudly how they don't fit skirting boards in their new homes because they don't want to be hiding anything. And this is, I think, what they were talking about. So the panels were all glued together with wood glue and also screwed to the floor joists to really make sure they would stay put and that we could sort of make the floor as airtight as possible. The sizable gaps were filled with squirty foam or silicone if they were smaller, and then sort of neatly trimmed around I think now I would be using probably slightly different kind of foam, because I think you can get one that doesn't expand as much, because once you cut into it, again, you're compromising the air tightness level. But I think we've done as good a job as we could have, really. And finally, I'm sad to say it took several months before we got to this age, this stage rather. It took us ages to decide on, we should have done this before starting really, but it took us ages to decide what to actually cover the floor with, because we wanted to find a material that would be environmentally friendly and that would be ethically sourced as well. Bamboo sounded perfect, but we couldn't. But it comes from China, and we couldn't find a supplier who could reassure us about labor rights and, you know, making sure that we're not walking on the floor effectively on someone's. Yeah. Anyway, we couldn't find the reassurance. So in the end, we opted for natural linoleum, which is made from 100% natural raw materials, including linseed oil. And unlike vinyl and down of phthalate or any other polluting chemicals, the smell goes pretty quickly actually, and it takes you back to lino cutting art classes, my partner said, which I think is quite a nice thing. And again, it took quite a while to find an installer willing and with the time to fit it, because the lino can crack if not handled properly during installation. So that took a bit of time, but just before Christmas, we actually managed to fit the lino and treat ourselves to a great looking floor. Now, was it all worth it? So unfortunately, all the participants didn't get to see the whole process. They have only seen the photos, and we've sort of, you know, done a blog about it, so, and shared that. But they didn't get to see the whole thing. It did take us a lot longer than I thought it would, but that was partly for other reasons as well, and not just because we just didn't quite know enough about what we were letting ourselves into. We were somewhat surprised to find that the insulation in the end cost us less, significantly less, than the floor covering itself. But I think we learned some really valuable lessons there in how to have a housewarming party, how to insulate a suspended timber floor, and above all, the room is actually warmer. We used to have our thermostat in this room, and now often in winter we actually have to move it into a different room, because otherwise you're nice and cozy in here while the rest of the house is freezing cold. So we don't have the kind of energy bills yet to kind of show the effect, or, you know, to make it, to disambiguate it from other things we've done. But we have this experience of the room actually being warmer. So I think I've witted through the process. So I think if you've got any questions, I'll hand over to Andy. I'll stop sharing for a bit.
That's very good, Ivana. Thank you for that. And it was good fun as well. I mean, we spent all weekend talking about sustainability, and I really felt there was quite a few people had kind of light bulb moments about things that they could do simply in their own homes. One thing I just wanted to add about I mean, U values are the best and very simple measure of heat flow through a surface. With bare floorboards or chipboard, the kind of but then no insulation, then the U value is about 3.3 before you start. If you've already got underlaying carpet, then you're starting at a U value of about 2.4. With putting 300 millimeters of mineral wool, as we were able to in your house, even with the putting chipboards on and no carpet on top, the calculated U value is 0.14, and it would actually be a little bit less if you had underlaying carpet. So we're really down to passive house kind of levels there. The other thing that I wanted to agree with you is that they reckon about 15% of heat loss is through the floor. But one of the biggest problems, and possibly even worse than that direct heat loss, is the cold air that's blowing in. Because any cold air that's coming into a house, of course, is displacing warm air that you've paid for or heated in some other way through the other house. So what you've ended up with is an airtight insulated floor, and that's just good all round, really.
Thank you, and thank you for all your help.
You're welcome.
We've got a question on mice. Any tips on keeping mice from underneath floors? Not quite sure what to say to that. We haven't had mice
quite
here.
Good to remove your floorboards to check if you have mice, because you have an opportunity that you not always get to see if there's any entrance for them under your floorboards. See this as an opportunity and not as a risk.
Lars is completely right, and one of the huge opportunities of lifting a floor like this is it allows you to check the condition of the timbers, and a couple of times I've had to replace floor joists. It allows you to look to see if you have got any excessive moisture. Perhaps that's an indicator of a drainage problem or a pipe leak or something like this. But the really important thing is to check that you've got enough airflow under the house. What you really need is a howling gale under there to stop any excessive moisture buildup, but you just don't want that draft to come into the living space. So looking for signs of rodents is another good thing, and blocking those up. I mean, it's easy to block a gap with foam, but they just eat their way through it. So the recommendation I'm going to give you is you just put some wire wool into the gap before you fill it with foam, and they won't eat their way back in.
You can also check for woodworm. That is something we found, which was also not always visible from above. And what Ivana was mentioning was, you don't know what your former builders were hiding under there, because we found not just huge amounts of rubble, but all sorts of other things under the floorboard, and some of them were restricting the airflow quite significantly. So if you're particularly moving into a new house and you're doing anyway substantial one, it's a good opportunity to just double check and give you the peace of mind that you actually know what's underneath.
Extremely good points, thank you. One floor that I did in Rothwell in Leeds, we found a clay pipe, an actual original clay pipe from whenever the house was built, and the owner was delighted to find this. And also, you quite often find, cigarette packets, number 6 or number 10, that kind of thing, or newspapers with a date on it, and you could buy a car for 3 and 6 pence, that kind of thing. Very, very archaeological. The other thing we've got to do is you've got to deal with the wires. We don't want local overheating of wires, particularly the heavy current carrying. So we just got to put some conduit over that whenever it's running through insulation. So it's just another part of the preparation before you put the insulation in there. What I aim at actually is a 400mm depth of mineral wool, if you've got the space down there to put it. And even with floorboards, that's going to get you down to a U value of 0.1, which is entirely commendable as a retrofit.
Great. Now, do you have any tips for removing floorboards? There's discussions about crowbars versus pallet busters.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult. It's just there are just so many of them. There's hundreds of nails, and once they get to be rusty, they grip very, very hard indeed. And to be honest, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could just drive them in, just knock them in. It's not going to make a significant difference to the thermal performance of the timber with some bits of metal or an angle grinder. Just nip them off at the top. But it's very pleasing to pull them out, I have to say. Piles of dust bridging damp between ground and timber. Yeah, you can have a really good look. Solid floor construction, that's right. It all depends on how deep the floor is. I mean, there we go. Oh, still, yeah, mice stealing oats. Very good. But the borrowers live down there as well, I think, Jesper. Yeah, it all depends on the space that you've gone down there. But I don't, it's very rare that you're going to be able to fill the entire void with insulation. You really need some kind of suspension system. And the one that we put in at Ivana's is very cheap, very relatively quick. And I thought of some ways of speeding it up even from what we did at yours. But it's I basically repurposed the stainless steel wall hangers that you get for new build, and then I used tunnelized tile lat, which is about £3 for a 4.2 meter length, 19 by 38, I seem to remember, section. So yeah, very, very quick, really.
I'll just add to that on the blog post, which I will share if you haven't seen it already, there is the list of all the materials we used and the tools. So if anyone wants to repeat the exercise, then yeah, there's hints there.
And also a video of the floorboard dance, the chipboard dance. It's very important that people should learn this as part of a retrofit.
Yeah, I didn't include it here because someone was wondering whether it gives the wrong impression of your community energy jumping on floorboards, but I do still like it myself because it was quite fun to watch, I must say. It's just a way of making sure that the boards are slotted in nicely within the tongue and groove, and it looked like fun. Now, Tom was asking, that's probably a question for me, how the room has been during the really hot days. Which is a very good question. It is a bit hard to assess because this room is sort of adjacent to the kitchen, which has big patio doors. It's in the extension and it's connected. There's no doors in between. So it's sort of protected by that. We have replaced the patio doors with triple glazed, super duper triple glazed doors, which I can't just recommend highly enough because it was a total revelation to me. We had sort of really shoddy double glazed doors, which were just condensing over the winter, causing mold in the corners with that. They were really horrible, didn't work. I was finding it really hard to open them, didn't like them at all. Installed triple glazed doors in the same year as we did that. So last autumn after the insulation party, and the first time we came downstairs, we saw there was condensation on the door and we thought, oh my God, what's going on? And then we realized it was on the outside of the door. It wasn't inside the house. And ever since then, actually, if anything, the condensation appears at fairly regular intervals during the winter. We've even seen it over the summer if there's big enough temperature difference in sort of daytime, nighttime temperatures. And so it's a bit hard to know what has contributed to the house temperatures during the heat wave. We're also quite careful about closing curtains to kind of keep the heat out and not opening the sort of doors to the south facing side. So it's a bit hard to know how much the floor has helped, but I would have thought it does help temper the temperature inside in some way, but I can't. It's much easier to tell that it certainly keeps the warmth longer in the winter. Are there any more questions? I'm just checking. I can't see any more. So I think I will just share my screen once more, just as a little invitation. So, and to thank everyone, thank you so much, Phil, Lars and Andy, for giving your time tonight, for sharing your experiences, because I think this is a really good way to learn how to kind of to get inspired and learn how to sort of make homes much more comfortable, cheaper to run, and ultimately what really interests me is and plenty of you, all of you probably, is how to kind of reduce the carbon emissions while we're doing all of that. So thank you all for coming tonight, for not staying outside in that lovely sunshine to start with. And if you'd like to see more events like this, then please do support and join SendNext, and your community energy as well. I am wearing 2 hats here, and there's quite a few more events coming up actually, which I'm afraid you will see me at. And I will send all these through an email as a follow-up. But for instance, next Monday, we will be talking about introducing the Green Homes grants, which you may be interested in using to make upgrades to your home, and talking about some of the potential pitfalls there. And we are trialing a course in carbon literacy. So actually teaching people to talk about climate change, about climate emergency, really, we should be talking about, because it's not just changing a little bit. We are at a point of crisis. So the way we talk about it affects the way in people react and in how they act. So learning to speak carbon is, I think, a very useful skill to have. SendNext AGM is coming up, so is your community energies. I'm very pleased to say we will have Paul Allen from CAT, from Centre for Alternative Technology, talking about the Zero Carbon Britain, and we'll also have Andy Butley from Oddly 2030, so quite a lot of interesting information there. And just very freshly, we actually have another Open Eco Homes event coming up, which I'm just finalizing, where we have Selena, who's done up a really nice old, I think possibly Victorian house down by the river. It's done lots of energy efficiency improvements, and then also had to do quite a lot of flood proofing work, because rather than the house being flooded once every decade or less, as they were told when they moved into the house has already been flooded twice while they've lived in it. So she's combining flood proofing with energy efficiency, which I think is a really interesting combination. And we've also got Mike Charles, who's the campaigns director at Friends of the Earth, who happens to live in York and has been kind of gradually improving his house. I am looking for a potential third house. So if there's anyone out there who would like to share their experiences of doing up your home, then please do get in touch. There's still time. It's on 15th of October.